So today we're going to continue our journey through Dr. Will Gaffney's lectionary, and the passage for this week is 1 Thessalonians 2, verses 1 through 8. I will be reading it out loud, but you can follow along if you'd like. You yourselves know, sisters and brothers, our coming to you is not in vain. On the contrary, we have suffered previously and been mistreated in Philippi, as you know. We had courage in our God to declare to you all the gospel of God in spite of much opposition. For our exhortation is not from deceit or corruption or trickery. Rather, just as we have been approved by God to be entrusted with the gospel, so do we speak, not to please women or men, but to please God who tests our hearts. Now, we never came with a word of flattery, as you all know, or with pretext for greed. Our God is our witness. Nor did we seek praise from women and men, rather from you all or from others. Though we could have made demands as apostles of God, rather we were childlike among you, even like a nurse tenderly caring for her own children. Thus, so caring for you all, it is our pleasure to share with you not only the gospel of God, but also ourselves, because you have become beloved to us. The word of the Lord. So this passage requires a little bit of context for us because Paul seems to be referring to things that the church at Thessalonica are aware of, but we 2,000 years later are not. So we need to take a look back at the book of Acts, and we can find some helpful information from there. So for those who don't know, the book of Acts is a narrative history of the growth of the early church, and it follows Paul's ministry pretty closely. So in Acts 16, we encounter Paul and Silas, who are declaring the good news that Jesus is Lord and Caesar isn't. And in that declaration, they experience some persecution, which is what Paul is referencing in this passage. This news that Jesus is Lord and Caesar isn't is making people angry. Because there are people who have benefited from the power of Caesar, and Paul and his partner Silas in this missionary journey are speaking against that. And we kind of have to ask, why might that be? Why is the message that Jesus is Lord and Caesar isn't? Why is that threatening or disruptive? So I want us to imagine living in a world where everyone is forced into a role. You're defined solely by where you were born and who your parents are. Your whole identity is handed to you at birth, and that's thanks in large part to the systems that say Caesar is Lord. But then someone like Paul comes into your town and starts telling you something that's different. Starts telling you that you're not valued by your social status, gender, or ethnicity. You're valued as one loved by God. And that in God's kingdom, you're free. You're liberated from the systems that gave you a false identity, and you're free to embrace and live into what God has made you to be. And you're free to bring that liberation from oppressive system to others. That is the declaration. Jesus is Lord, Caesar is not. This is the good news that Paul declared and enacted in his ministries. And when he was in Philippi, Paul was again declaring and enacting the good news of God. And in so doing, there's an account, again, back to Acts 16, where he casts a demon out of a slave girl, liberating her from oppression. Everyone should be celebrating at this. But what we find out is that she is owned by two men who have been benefiting off of her demon possession. They've been benefiting off of her bondage. And they get big mad because they can no longer make money off of this enslaved girl. So they call in the authorities on Paul and on Silas, and they're publicly beaten and then thrown in jail. The next morning, they're freed only because the authorities find out that Paul and Silas are actually Roman citizens, and it was illegal to publicly beat or imprison someone who had Roman citizenship without a trial. So now the authorities are in trouble. What I think is really interesting, among many other things in this case, is that we see that Paul and Silas have actually benefited from their privilege as Romans in this case. But this is the same privilege that they used to bring liberation to the enslaved girl. And I think we can pause for a minute and reflect on how this is a really good reminder that everyone in this room carries some amount of privilege. Whether it's your status as a citizen of the United States, your physical abilities, your gender, your economic status, your race, sexual orientation. We all have privileges. So the question isn't really who has privilege, but rather how are we using our privilege? How are we using the privilege that we have? Are we using it for others' liberation? Something to think about. So this persecution that Paul's referencing, right, the good news that he's talking about to the people at Thessalonica, all of this persecution is happening because Paul, Silas, the church at Thessalonica, these little house churches that are planted all over, are disrupting the systems of the Roman world. It's known as the Pax Romana, or Roman peace. But this system of peace was held together by a top-down authority structure that kept everybody peaceful with violence. There was a certain order and a certain hierarchy, and those who crossed the lines faced some consequences. Ultimately, it led to a lot of folks' death. But Paul and Silas and the early Jesus followers were literally turning the world upside down. They were crossing all kinds of lines. They were disrupting the social, political, and religious order. And everybody who was benefiting from the status quo, everyone who was benefiting from the systems of Rome, were not happy about it. Does it sound familiar? It's also important, I found this really interesting in my research, that because Paul seems to be defending himself against greed or speaking from a place of greed, that there was like a movement during the first century of folks traveling from town to town as teachers, and so they were sort of expressing oratorical prowess and skill, and they were trying to find followers who would pay them to instruct them, and so they were trying to make money off of people's vulnerability. And Paul wants to make sure that he distances himself from that category as one who's not like looking to just make money. He's actually looking out for freedom. He wants folks free. So now we can a little bit better understand what Paul is addressing when he's talking to the church at Thessalonica. And he begins this passage by defending himself against the slander that some folks have said about his ministry. And his response to that slander is, it's God who has empowered them to speak and to act. They have done so not with deceit or faulty motivations, like trying to make money off of people who might be attracted to their teaching, but instead, they're empowered to speak, to declare, to enact the kingdom of God with authenticity. It's a message of freedom that comes from the good news of God's kingdom. Paul's emphasizing that he's both declaring and enacting the freedom that comes from living in a kingdom where Jesus is Lord and Caesar is not. He's emphasizing that there is no monetary motivation here. Some of you might know this. The Religious Society of Friends, known as Quakers, were the first corporate body in North America to fully condemn slavery. And they were doing this in the 1600s. They were doing it before it was cool. But not only that, they didn't just speak out and condemn slavery. They also became active in the abolition movement and in supporting and educating formerly enslaved people. They were a church organization who, seeing the harmful effects of racism, used their power and privilege not only to declare good news of liberation, but also assisted in bringing long-term liberation to the enslaved people of North America. There's a church in Winston-Salem, North Carolina called Trinity Moravian Church. In March of this year, they relieved $3.3 million in medical debt for North Carolina residents. This church, who saw the debilitating effects of a capitalistic system, not only declared the good news of liberation, but used their power and privilege to disrupt the systems that victimizes the poor and profits off of suffering. $3.3 million in medical debt relief. Ekklesia, our community, is in a lot of ways following in the footsteps of these examples. We've been intentional about using our privilege and evaluating our privilege to disrupt systems of oppression. We've not always done things perfectly by any means, but we're learning to structure ourselves as a safe and a brave space for folks to come and to be. The examples of the Quaker and the Moravian Church embody a different way of doing things that has led to some discomfort at best and slander at worst from other members of the larger, what I like to call Big C church around us. Because folks don't know what to do with a church community who's willing to speak truthfully. They don't know what to do with a church community who actively disrupts the systems, the oppressive systems, the ones who disrupt the status quo. And I think that's because the truth is the church has far too long benefited from the systems of power. The church has benefited from a system that marginalizes some and gives all the power to others. And like Paul, we might want to be quick to defend our position to those on the outside or to those who have heard some untruths about who we are or what we're doing. Not that kind of Christian or not that kind of church becomes our defensive refrain. And I think it's okay to say that. I think that's okay. But Paul doesn't stop with a defense. He shifts into a softness that I think is really compelling and I think is something that we can learn from. He moves on to speak of the way that they came to Thessalonica with a childlike attitude. Or that could also be translated as a gentle attitude. What would it look like for a church to look gentle? They approached the people with the good news, not with a heavy-handed authoritarian tone, but they shared the gospel and themselves. They gave of themselves. They declared and enacted the liberative power of God's kingdom, and they cared for the community in the same way that a mother nurses their young. A mother who gives of themselves to nourish their young. See, the implication here is that Paul and Silas are not concerned with conversion, at least not in the way that we might understand conversion today. I think it's been reduced to a one-time decision that gives us like a free pass into heaven, right? But Paul's idea of conversion is something wholly different. It's about longevity. It's about maturity. It's concerned with how a community is being nurtured, how a community is thriving. And this can only happen as a mother gives of herself to sustain the health and vitality of her children. I don't know about you, but this imagery is both comforting and unexpected. As I read this passage, I found myself reflecting on how this is the opposite of some of the leadership that we've seen in churches today. Churches who are more concerned with holding on to their own power at the expense of those with no power. And there are churches, like I mentioned earlier, who are trying to model a community that mothers, a community of mutuality. I think again about the Quaker Church, who has operated as an egalitarian community since day one, since the very beginning. They're a community that values the mutual flourishing of all of its members. And there's a lot that I think we can learn from the Quaker movement. And I also think very specifically of our community. I think of the ways that we're a place who's trying to stay aware of what our faulty motives might be, a place where we're attempting to lean into and value authenticity. I think of the ways we care deeply about the health and vitality of one another. I think about the fact that we're a place where we desire the flourishing of the larger community that surrounds us, and we're working intentionally to find ways that we can grow others in flourishing. I think about our community as a place where others might find safety and rest and space to grow, to be liberated. This path, this way of doing things is a lot slower and less efficient than the path of Caesar. I mean, there's a reason that the Roman Empire was so successful. They conquered you, you followed the rules, or you died. Do what we say, or go away. But the path that Paul embodies, the one that's laid out before us in the person of Jesus, while slower, is a more compelling way. It's more compelling and it's harder. It's more difficult. Because there will be discomfort. There will be disruption. There will be resistance. We'll have to say goodbye to our security, to our ego, to our false sense of self. And as we say goodbye to all of that, we find freedom and flourishing on the other side. And it sounds counterintuitive, but that is just exactly what the kingdom of God is and what it does. It flips all of our systems, all of our ways of being on their heads and leads us to true freedom, true shalom, true flourishing, and not just for ourselves, but for everyone.